Hey everyone, happy Friday. Welcome to another session of Podchaser Pro's webinar series. Before we get started, yes, this will be obviously be recorded and it'll also end up on our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, post haste, make sure you rate, review, subscribe. What are we saying these days? But in any case, we are going to unpack a couple different things today. Chiefly among them is going to be about podcast guest pitching. Now, if you joined us for our last webinar session, we unpacked some of the reasons why podcast guest booking has gotten harder in 2025. And hopefully, you came away from that not discouraged, but actually encouraged that it's never been easier, I think, to separate yourself from the rest of what people are doing, when it comes to podcast guest booking. And again, some of the reasons why it's getting harder is podcast hosts have become more discerning about who they have on their programs. There's a big, emphasis with that. Production values of podcasts have increased significantly over the last 6 to 12 months, and a lot of that has to do with the rise of the video podcast and YouTube's inclusion of podcasts within their player apps and such. And then, of course, one of the other reasons why podcast guest pitching has gotten much harder is because of AI. And I think one of the things that we see in the market currently, whether it's from client side or prospect side, is great. Most databases are going to have almost every show. A lot of them are going to have different levels of data. And if you are a pro customer, you already know what kind of data we provide. But the data is just the data. How do we actually achieve the outcomes that we want to get? And that's, of course, getting our clients or our internal stakeholders booked as guests on podcasts. So while the data is great, we also need to figure out how to pitch. And throughout this presentation, we'll be doing just that. I've discussed this framework previously in old webinars, and this time we're going to go a little bit deeper, and that's the 4A's framework. So before I get super duper into the weeds with this, I suppose it'd probably be helpful for me to share my screen with everybody so we can go about it from there. Do do do. Cool. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Maybe throw it in the chat. Just give me a thumbs up. Let's see. Jules, yep, you're good to go. Awesome. All right, I will enter presentation mode. Cool. All right, so again, this is going to be the 4A's framework. Now, what is the 4A's framework? Great question. I can't take credit for creating the 4A's framework. It was actually popularized by a content creator named Dickie Bush. Dickie is the founder of Ship 30 for 30, which is an online digital writing cohort-based business. He's also done quite a bit on the podcast circuit as well. So that's kind of near and dear to the universe that we play in as well. But effectively, what the 4H framework really espouses is that most content is going to fall into one of four buckets and sometimes multiple buckets, and that is actionable, analytical, aspirational, and anthropological. Now, why am I talking about this and what the heck does it have to do with podcast pitching? And it's a good question, but really, when we talk about the bucketization of content, um, the best podcast guest pitches are going to be ones that recognize who the host is, what their show is all about, and the audience that they serve. So if we're not taking that initial kind of research oriented step to again understand who the host is and what kind of show that they create, it doesn't matter if we have the world's greatest guest pitch if it's not aligned with again the podcast, then we're gonna struggle. So I know some of us are going to be a bit more concerned about how do we format a podcast guest pitch? Should we be using links? Should we be including attachments? How often should we follow up? We'll get to all that good stuff in a bit, but I think again the emphasis of going through this 4A's framework process is really to set ourselves up for more success. So um, again, when we can categorize what the podcast is all about through the actionable, analytical, aspirational, or anthropological frames, then we can also craft a pitch that's going to tie into that as well. So again, we will be going through that with this whole session here. So again, like how do we summarize this even further? What's the actionable lens? That's going to be like the here's how. Analytical is going to be more like numerical driven, so numbers, data, that sort of thing. Aspirational is going to be just as it sounds. Yes, you can. Oftentimes we'll call that like the ratio algebra story or that sort of thing. And then the anthropological podcasts are going to be more about here's why. And it's going to take a much more kind of complex kind of frame, if you will. But we're going to go through each of these, and I'm going to provide a couple different examples because, again, I know this is somewhat of a foreign concept, and having done some teaching on the 4A's framework previously, it all sounds great, but how do we concretize it with examples? So in this next kind of section here, what you'll see is going to be 4 different books. They are all about money, but each of them approaches money from a very different lens. So the first is going to be I Will Teach You to Be Rich. The second is going to be The Changing World Order, and then Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and it's, of course, Psychology of Money as well. Now, if anybody wants to throw this in the chat, like, can you very quickly assess or identify which book is associated with each respective lens? Give you like 30 seconds if you want to throw it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll just keep going. And what you'll see, of course, as I'm revealing the answer here, is I Will Teach You to Be Rich is going to be actionable. Changing World Order is going to be analytical. Aspirational is going to be Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and anthropological is going to be psychology of money. So how do we know these are like the proper frames or the proper buckets, if you will, for each of them? I Will Teach You to Be Rich. I mean, obviously the title gives it away a little bit, but it's going to be step-by-step processes. Ramit Sethi has done quite a bit of not just on writing, but obviously podcasting on like step-by-step processes to get budgets in line, to take control of your finances. And it's less about acknowledging the world from which maybe you came from and why you're having these issues with money, that sort of thing. And instead, it's just going to be very kind of tactical step-by-step process. So when we think about actionable, when we think about podcasts that are actionable, we're going to be looking for a couple different call outs, and we'll get to some of those call outs here in a second. Same thing with on the analytical side. So Ray Dalio is a world-class investor, et cetera. He's dealing with financial markets and how that pertains to money. So it's going to be a highly analytical kind of style. Aspirational is going to be sorry, not Dr., but Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? So he talks about some of the different stories and the ways that people have kind of pulled themselves up from the bootstraps and exited poverty and entered into wealth. And then, of course, something like psychology of money is going to be anthropological because it's going to take here's why money works the way that it does. Here's how we allow our psychology to get the best of us, preventing us from making the best financial decisions for ourselves as well. But again, to kind of continue to shape up this point, right? Actionable, these are going to be tactical, implemental pieces of content. The reader should gain some new insight, reader or listener, insight or instruction they didn't have beforehand. And this is usually going to look like tips, hacks, curation, resources, ultimate guides, that sort of thing. It's going to take a core idea and it's going to help the reader, the audience, put it into practice. When we're thinking about this from an identification perspective on the podcast side, a couple things to call out. Usually, the first place we want to look to assess what some of the fit factors are going to be there is going to be the podcast description itself. So I'll show you an example of that here in a second. We also want to look at the way in which the podcaster titles their episodes because that's going to give us a pretty good understanding. For example, if we were trying to find, analytical or actionable podcasts, excuse me, we might be looking for podcasts that frequently have episode titles that are like how to or the 6-step process or kind of things along those lines. The 4 genius growth hacks to do X, Y, and Z, right? So these are going to be some of the call outs we're going to want to look for. And again, when we talk about the 4A's and how it matches between kind of the podcast discovery aspect as well as the podcast pitching aspect, uh, the huge component of this is not just on looking at the podcast, but also looking at the guest that you're representing. So hopefully by going through this process, and I'll kind of give you a stepwise version of that, which is a meta, of course, here in the actionable sense. But I'll give you the process that I use in assessing each of these. But one of the things, again, we need to be very conscientious of is like which bucket, actionable, analytical, aspirational, or anthropological, does our guest fit in? And the topics that our guests can actually speak to fit in. Um, so if I'm representing somebody that has built a 7-step process to get your credit in check and improve your credit score using these 7 simple steps, I'm going to want to find podcasts that are also talking about actionable 7-step process, how to, very tactical types of shows. So again, like this is where on the 4A side, we're matching it from the podcast side as well as our guest credentials, and then the actual pitch that we write is going to be reflective of that as well. So that's going to be actionable. The next is going to be analytical. So these are going to be breakdowns involving numbers, frameworks, processes. These are going to look like trends, reasons, numbers, examples, teardowns, swipe files. It's going to help the audience, the reader, unlock new ways of thinking. I will say most of these are going to be more like I would say current events focused in a number of ways, especially if we're talking about business related categories. If you don't have a client you're working with that does anything, as it pertains to financial markets or business or that sort of thing, this is not going to be as relevant for you. So I know we work with quite a few book publishers. There's probably not going to be a ton by way of that, depending on the genre of books that your clients are writing. But if there are more technically inclined clients, whether it's on the business side, science, technology, startups, AI, I know we've got quite a bit of AI and related clients of clients that come through. This is going to be a pretty big one, yeah, because it's going to look at the data side and it's going to allow you to do some very interesting data storytelling. So again, we want to align our analytical destination, which is going to be the podcast we want to pitch with our client's perspectives. So if you've got a client that has an annual report or a client that is unpacking certain trends, this is going to be one of the things where we'll use like a quick heuristic to be able to assess whether the show is going to be a fit for some of our clients or not. And again, by means of like real world examples with this, a lot of the like content marketing that I do for Podchaser is going to be on the analytical side. So, of course, about 10 days ago at this point, perhaps you've all seen at this juncture, but the Astronomer CEO was caught in the middle of doing something inappropriate at a Coldplay concert. You might remember that. It's been all over the internet. Well, one thing that Podchaser is uniquely able to do with our podcast monitoring solution is to find mentions of certain keywords, topics, genres, etc. So while everyone was kind of morally placating or pontificating about the astronomer CEO's role in kind of the scandal, if you will, uh, I actually wanted to figure out how much has Coldplay benefited from this controversy. And so, sure enough, I looked at the number of mentions of Coldplay in podcasts over the last 30 days, as well as the last 7 days. Over the last 30 days, there were something like 2,700 mentions of Coldplay in podcasts. And in the last 7 days, there were 2,200. So almost, there's like a 1,180% increase in the mentions of Coldplay over the last 7 days. Now, that's a trend. If I wanted to pitch myself as a guest on somebody else's podcast, what I would do is say, using Podchaser Pro data, I was able to find, Coldplay's experiencing a renaissance. Then I would probably pick and pluck some data from how much has Coldplay been streamed additionally on Spotify in that same time horizon. How many Google searches have come up with for Coldplay in that same 7 day and 30 day horizon, and kind of give like a comparative analysis of, yes, everyone's talking about the disgraced CEO and the head of HR, but also there's kind of a silly version of this story that Coldplay's back, right? So that would be an example of an analytical one where I've got the first party data, I've got data that I can kind of compartmentalize or package together and to tell a much different narrative. So in any case, that is going to be on the analytical side. Next one is going to be on the aspirational. So these are usually going to look like lessons, mistakes, reflections, personal stories, stories of growth, advice to past self, etc. I don't know if anybody's ever read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but it kind of tells two divergent stories. And there's a lot of ways in which the author uses literary devices to help us help place ourselves in some of the characters' positions, right? So we can see ourselves within the story. The good thing about aspirational podcasts, is, especially as it pertains to matching the podcast with the guest pitch, is there's going to be a lot of aspirational podcasts. So, like, personal learning, personal growth, journaling. These are all going to be like very strong categories for us to look at when it comes to podcast categories. I think one thing to kind of call out here is everybody has a story, right? So if you're working with your client, I would just kind of orient them with, everyone is going to be pitching their personal story. Everyone has been through something, that sort of thing. But as we relate the 4A framework back, and what we'll see is how can we combine two of the different A's to create a much more compelling pitch. Because if we lead with just like a purely aspirational pitch, what are going to be some of the key things that are going to differentiate your client from everybody else who's ever pitched themselves as guests on podcasts? So again, this is going to be how we're going to start to kind of compound these additional frames. Finally, it's going to be anthropological. This is going to be a little bit more heady, I would say, for a couple of reasons. These are going to be speaking to like universal truths about human nature. So often it's going to look like fears, failures, struggles, observations, comparisons, why others are wrong, why you've been misled, etc. And the ultimate goal of anthropological content, whether it be podcasts or your client, is going to be to help audiences understand why things are the way that they are. So again, this is going to take a unique level of talent. It's going to take a unique level of pitch, of course, and we also need to find shows that are going to be aligned from the anthropological side. This is going to be again one of the more difficult ones to find, as well as to kind of coalesce into this matching of the content with the guest through the pitch itself. But these are going to be some really interesting ones. And they also, much like our previous slide with the aspirational, they also typically include multiple of the 4A's. So I'll show you how we're going to get there here in a second. But first, like, how do we actually make this happen? So we talked about books. Now, how do we parlay this into podcasts? This is a real example. So this is going to be Think Fast, Talk Smart. And the podcast name itself is Communication Techniques, right? So if we remember back to what some of the requisites are for a podcast that falls into the actionable category, remember we looked at how-tos, strategies, tactics, that sort of thing. And if you just simply look at the podcast description, so this is going to be self-sourced by the podcasts themselves, which you can see, of course, within Podchaser Pro. You can see that they call it very clearly: actionable insights, practical strategies, tools, techniques, and best practices to express yourself in any situation. So again, this isn't going to be like the 7-step process you need to do, so on and so forth, in the description of the podcast itself. But if we were actually to click into the episodes, we would also want to understand how do the episode titles look. We can click into some of the transcripts for those episodes as well. What are some of the questions that the podcast host asks of the guest? So again, like, this is going to be a much more research intensive process. And if that's a dissuader for a lot of us, I think that might be a good reason to kind of pull back a little bit and go back to what I talked about as we first kind of hopped down the call here together. podcast guest pitching has gotten a lot harder, and it's because people are not taking the time and using the intentionality to actually understand the podcast. So again, if your goal is to get more of your clients or more of your internal people booked as guests on podcasts, going the extra step and going a little bit above and beyond by doing this level of research and by taking this amount of time is going to separate you from everybody else who's just spraying and praying, right? So again, this is just going to be a quick example on the actionable side. Next, wanted to find a podcast that is more so along the analytical side. So this is going to be Prof G Markets. So Scott Galloway, some notable podcaster. He hosts another show, Pivot, with Kara Swisher. But this is his market show where he's looking at stocks and finance and that sort of thing. So Prof G Markets breaks down the news that's moving the capital markets. And again, this is going to be something where if you've ever listened to one of these episodes, they're looking at numbers primarily. They're looking at trends. They're looking at some of the data behind some of these movers and shakers. They're offering insights, analysis, that sort of thing. So when we look at analytical, if I've got a client that can speak to recent market trends. And I'm thinking about one client we used to have in particular when we used to run our podcast guest booking service, Podchaser Connect, and they did a lot of work in the financial markets. So when there were rumors of the Fed raising rates or cutting rates, et cetera, we would always be able to get our client booked as a guest on podcast because the podcast wanted to talk about what would this mean for the markets, and the guest knew exactly what it would mean based on their own subject matter expertise. So, and they would bring data to the table with it. So, if you cut rates by 0.25%, what is that going to do to the bond market, to the treasuries, to so on and so forth, right? So again, this is going to be much more oriented towards kind of current events, I would say, especially as it pertains to business, tech, science in many respects. Again, analytical is not going to be for every client. It's not going to be representative of everybody, but this oftentimes leads to kind of cutting the line, if you will, because as information breaks, as news stories kind of take foothold within the public zeitgeist, this allows us a lot more deeper insights, and helps us align guest pitches much more quickly and thoroughly. I guess another example I would use for this. A few years ago, we were working with a university, and they had some of the foremost experts on Eurasian geopolitics. And as the war between Ukraine and Russia broke out, there was obviously so much commotion, so much misunderstanding, so much just trying to figure out what was happening through the fog of war. And so many podcasts wanted to have like real experts appear on the show because, of course, this was going to be a dominant course of conversation, what ended up being for 3 years. So we had been pitching these Eurasian experts on like history podcasts that were looking at some of like the anthropological reasons why there were tensions always between Ukraine and Russia, et cetera. But as we were able to kind of move up the ladder, if you will, and kind of enter that social zeitgeist as the news stories were breaking, they were able to insert like real-time analysis as to what it meant to have a foothold in the Donbas region. All these types of things just open up so many more opportunities. So again, the way we were able to do that is, hey, here we can cite this research paper that our client wrote about the ethnocentricities of Russians living in Ukraine and so on and so forth, and able to tie that into a podcast that was analyzing geopolitical events, right? So again, that's how we're going to marry those two things again. And then on the aspirational side, so again, we know this is going to be more like story oriented, typically founding, but this is going to be in her element, which is actually a podcast by Boston Consulting Group. And as you can see within this, they're digging, as the description says, they're digging deep into how powerhouse leaders got where they are, everything from the joy of projects gone right to the realities of family responsibilities, crucially asking, what was the moment you knew you weren't merely getting there, you had arrived? That's when you know you're in your element, right? So again, The goal with most aspirational content is going to be storytelling and oftentimes origin stories, triumphs, travails, and everywhere in between. So um, it's a lot easier if you're working with clients that have overcome some significant challenges. And if you've attended one of our previous webinars, you might remember the exercise that I've talked about called first, last, best, worst. In that first, last, best, worst exercise, it's a very simple thing. Um, on the right on the columns, you're going to ask those questions: first, last, best, first, last, best, worst. And if you were to look at from like a rows perspective, it'd be like first time you tried to raise capital, first time you started a new business, that sort of thing. So you're asking your client these questions, all with the goal of like the who, what, where, when, why, and how of these things. So if you are working with a client that is more open to sharing their personal story, their personal journey, that sort of thing, that would be a great way to approach a lot of different podcasts is through that aspirational lens, especially if they do have some of that tension built into their story. And as communicators, PR people, oftentimes aspirational feels the most natural for us because we have taken a lot of different methods to building story and weaving narrative and that sort of thing. Whereas some of the other lenses are a little more difficult for us to get to. So all I would say about the aspirational outside of finding shows which are going to be in abundance because podcasts like to talk about the storytelling aspect, and then of course marrying that with your client and in crafting their story is just be a little bit more discerning. It's easy for us to get lost in the aspirational side, but if your client has hired you to get them booked as client as guests on podcasts, and they've got clear business KPIs, whether it's inbound leads, share of ear, brand awareness with certain markets, and that sort of thing, it's easy to get the warm and fuzzy feeling from the aspirational hits. But also, we need to make sure that we're tying it back to our business objectives and the reasons why our clients hired us. So, in any case, just one word of caution on the aspirational side. And then finally, anthropological. Again, I wanted to give a real world example from the podcast side. And this is going to be kind of a cherry picked one, truthfully. This is the economics of everyday things, which is going to be a Freakonomics podcast. Freakonomics, I don't know if anybody has read, those books and listen to the podcast, etc. But they were kind of like the modern equivalent of anthropological content to come out oftentimes discussing things like why are things the way that they are? Why, um, what is causing prices to change, and who determines the cost of a pack of gum, and why is it so much different than it was in the 1950s when we were putting bubble gum wrappers in our bicycle wheels, that sort of thing. And as you can see, even from their description here, so who decides which snacks in your office's vending machine? How much is a suburban elm tree worth, and to whom? How do Girl Scout cookies become $1 billion business, etc.? So, again, this is going to go beyond just the data. It's going to go beyond just the analysis. It's going to like try to unpack the why behind everything. And again, these are going to be some really interesting ones. But as you can see, like the scaffolding for anthropological, it has to be based on some level of analytical content. It sometimes has some aspirational content, but oftentimes it's going to kind of culminate in what we'll call this anthropological lens. So yes, moving on. So again, under the premises of the webinar invite, we will talk about guest pitching. I promise you that. The most important part first is to identify the right target. So this is going to be step one. How do we want to identify our guests lens first? So step one, how do we identify the guest 4A alignment? The first, with the actionable, we want to ask questions like, does our guest bring something to the table like step-by-step guidance, tips, strategies, how-tos, these sorts of things? I've given some examples of this before, but if your client that you're working with is one of the foremost solution architects for integrating a HubSpot CRM with OpenAI's ChatGPT, right? Like if they can bring to the table, hey, here's the 7-step process you need in order to get the maximum out of this integration, that's going to feel very much like an actionable pitch, right? So, and then if we know that that's going to be the actionable pitch, then we can go out and find the actionable podcasts that are going to be a fit. Secondarily, analytical. So, is the guest focused on data, numbers, trends, frameworks? Again, our example from the book side is going to be the changing world order. And our example on the podcast side was going to be Prof G markets, right? So again, you need to maybe do the first, last, best, worst process to pull some of these stories or pull some of this content out of the guests that you're working with or the thought leader you're working with. And then third, on the aspirational side, does the guest inspire listeners through stories of success, personal growth, or motivation? Again, everyone's got a version of this, so it's going to be the easiest to ascertain. However, it's going to be the most difficult to stand out unless they've really overcome some truly interesting and or tragic circumstances to achieve what they've achieved and gotten to the point where they're currently at. And then finally, on the anthropological side, does the guest explore human behavior, societal impacts, or the why behind certain phenomena? So again, these are going to be much more like think pieces, typically based in terms of research, data, analysis, etc. But it's also going to take that next logical leap into drawing some conclusions based on the data that's going to present new information in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been kind of proffered, right? So again, step one, go down your client roster, identify who the thought leaders are at each of your clients, and then answer these questions. Is this guest that I'm pitching more on the actionable side, analytical side, aspirational, or anthropological? Make a spreadsheet. I'll show you how I do that here in a second. Make a spreadsheet and just know which angles you can offer up to podcasts, and then when you move on to step two, identifying the right podcast for them, it's going to be much easier. Oops. So if aligning our guest with the 4A is our first step, our second step is going to be finding podcasts with matching 4A alignment. So again, we went through this, but just to encapsulate it, actionable podcasts, these are going to be podcasts that are offering practical advice, tutorials, how-to. Oftentimes, these are going to be business, health, productivity types of podcasts. Oftentimes, they're going to be shorter in length, not like a 10-minute necessarily, but they're not usually going to be a 3-hour podcast. They're not usually going to be more than, I'd say, probably 45 minutes, just because they are much more fast-paced, actionable, and that sort of thing. Some podcasts in this realm will be only about 15 minutes long. And I would just, again, use data that we have within Podchaser Pro we surface average episode length. And if you see it's 15 minutes, if you subtract out 2 or 3 minutes for intros and outros from the podcast and the editing process, your client's only going to be able to speak for about 10 minutes on a show that's about a 15-minute average length. So again, how do we prepare our client to speak super concisely and impactfully about the process that they've been able to unlock and that sort of thing? So again, actionable typically is going to be a little bit shorter. It's going to be more bite-sized. And usually it's going to look like things like tips, tricks, advice, productivity, that sort of thing. In terms of finding analytical podcasts, these are typically going to have call outs that are going to look like numbers, trends, in-depth breakdowns, analysis. Oftentimes, as I said, these are going to be like financial, tech, industry-specific podcasts. And when I say industry specific podcasts, I'm talking about like podcasts that are hosted or run or published by industry associations, that sort of thing. There's a lot more of these industry association related podcasts that have sprung up as they move away from kind of like the digital publisher model or traditional publisher model to digital publisher model now to kind of multimedia publisher model. And oftentimes what we'll see is, the cost of eggs is crazy. And this podcast is being run by the American Poultry Farmers Association. In an analytical podcast, it could talk about, why the price of eggs has fluctuated over time, and then some of the more recent data. Usually, will have an economist on and that sort of thing. So again, if you represent a client that is kind of in the poultry space and maybe they're a farmer or whatever, you'd want to find a podcast that's going to fit from that side of it because it's going to be aligned from the analytical perspective. Again, finding aspirational podcasts is going to be a lot easier for us. These are going to be motivational stories, lessons learned, personal growth journeys, etc. We want to find shows where guest interviews revolve around overcoming challenges. Again, I reference this as like the Horatio Alger story, that sort of thing. And then finally, Anthropological. These are going to be shows that explore the human sides of issues, societal trends, or behaviors, offer covering psychology, sociology, philosophy. And we want to find podcasts, and some of the call outs are going to be like why this happened or explanation. And these are going to be some of the keywords that we're going to look for, both in the podcast description, in the podcast episode titles and descriptions, as well as within transcript search. So again, in the broad sense, our first step is going to be identifying what our client's A angle is going to be. Secondarily, we want to find the podcasts that are going to align with that A angle, and how are we going to be able to find those? Again, from like the broader base thing, podcast titles and descriptions, episode title and descriptions, as well as transcripts. And within those transcripts, we can see, the types of questions that the host asked, the type of answers the guests are providing, and that's how we're going to kind of build this all together. And that'll take us to finally, as I promised with this webinar, writing a guest pitch using the 4A framework. So again, if it's actionable, if both media are actionable, focus your pitch on actionable advice that your guests can actually provide. So our guests can offer your listeners 5 strategies to improve their personal finance today based on insights from their blog. This is going to be really beneficial, again, because if you can point to previous works, if they've written a book, if they have a blog, if they have their own podcast, if they have a chain of custody basically of their thoughts and documented processes, this is going to be easy to get the host to not only see like, oh, this isn't just another guest pitch that I'm receiving, but this is also something that the person has created and spent time on. So oftentimes that's going to be a useful thing to include in guest pitches. And I'll show you exactly how we can frame that. Secondarily, with the analytical, when we pitch analytical podcasts, we want to emphasize the data and frameworks. So in their case study, our guest breaks down the latest economic trends with clear data-driven insights that can offer your listeners a detailed analysis of X, Y, and Z. So again, I'll use the example of our client that had the Eurasian experts. They had written a number of research reports and done some analysis as to the total number of Russian identifying citizens that lived in the Donbas region of Ukraine, right? So like, why are Russia and Ukraine fighting over the Donbas region? What is the kind of data tell us about all of these things? Well, how can we analyze this move, right? And not to get too deep into that skirmish, but again, I'm just bringing up interesting memories that felt like just yesterday. And with this, when the podcast is talking more so about the geopolitical analysis of the skirmish and ultimately war, they wanted data to be able to go off of and not just opinion. And I think that's one thing. If you are working with academics and you're pitching academics, most of them, if they're with R1, R2 research institutions, have to publish real research and not just spout off opinions. That might be the easier part of all of this, and working with uh, real researchers, I guess is the proper way to put it. There is that element of like true expertise versus somebody that you might be representing that's got an opinion about everything, but can't necessarily proffer first party data or research that they've gotten in the field, for example, right? So the more credentialed that your guest is, the easier it's going to be to get them booked as guests on analytical podcasts. And if they are not credentialed, if they have favorable court of public opinion, that will be helpful. But if you're working with somebody that just has a bunch of ideas, it's going to be difficult to gain entry into the analytical podcast world, just because typically the host is going to be somebody that's very much analytically inclined and typically a subject matter expert in their field as well. So if you take a non-expert and put them in front of an expert, chaos can ensue. On the aspirational side, so you want to lead with the inspiring journey. So our guest journey from debt to financial freedom will resonate deeply with your listeners. They can share their key mindset shifts needed to achieve long-term success. Again, this is going to be a little bit easier to identify, but the actual pitch itself needs to be more discerning. And I don't want to go too deep into this necessarily, but some of the ways in which we can do this is by looking at the episode transcripts, like I mentioned before. So again, it's going to depend on the subject matter of the podcast itself. Whether that's business aspirations or personal aspirations, overcoming divorce, loss of children, whatever that the case might be. We want to really understand like why the podcast asks us the types of questions that they ask, and how do we align that again with our guests' information. And there's a friend of Podchasers, and he hosts a podcast. It's called the Life Shift Podcast, and he exclusively examines the moments in which our lives have shifted. His name's Matt. He's a great guy. If you have a aspirational angled podcast guest, definitely look out for Matt and the Life Shift Podcast. But he's very vocal about publishing the why behind his podcast, and he actually recorded an interview recently, and it became very apparent to him that the guest wasn't capable of really getting to like the deepest reasons and the deepest parts of the why they had this life shift. And instead of going through and publishing the episode regardless, he thought it would be a violation of the core ethos of why he started the podcast to begin with, right? So that is one thing to be considerate of on the aspirational side, is if your client can't bring it, if your client can't go there, if your client can't get to the real crux of some of these things, then it might be better to leave the pitching altogether. So in any case, just a word of caution there. And then on the anthropological side, so societal insights, guest dives deep into the psychology behind financial decision making and explain why people struggle with money despite knowing better. So again, if we go back to some of the reasons or indicators for anthropological content, again, a lot of it's going to be why, things that you always thought, but you couldn't quite articulate yourself. There's a gentleman named Chris Walker who has recently run and recently exited an agency called Exit 5. They do content marketing and growth marketing, et cetera. And the reason why I'm bringing him up is because on the anthropological side, he identified that most marketing attribution tools were biased extremely towards Google and to Facebook, right? So Google basically takes the lion's share of credit, no matter what happens from an earned perspective or paid perspective, or organic search results. And as a result, his big anthropological lens was that marketers have become more technologists than like true practitioners, because they're relying on systems like Google and Facebook to tell them that they're doing a good job. And each of those platforms is prejudiced or biased towards proving that they're doing a good job, right? So his whole stance has been most marketing budgets are not well informed at all, because they're based off of self-serving data that's provided by the platforms, right? So like that's a huge anthropological breakthrough. It's kind of changed the way in which a lot of people are thinking about marketing budgets and allocations and that sort of thing. So if I were working with Chris, what I would do is find shows that are looking at some of these big picture uh, stories that are happening in the business world, and say, hey, my clients identified some of the reasons why CMO tenure only lasts 18 months, if that is the stat. I think it's close to that. And one of those reasons is because they're chasing that short-term win because they're under the gun from VCs or private equity or board of investors or board of directors or investors to prove short-term gains, and they're relying on bad data or at least inconclusive data from the two major platforms in Meta and Google, right? So like that's a pretty compelling thing. It's kind of controversial in some aspects, but the proof point is that it challenges conventional wisdom. So this doesn't necessarily mean you have to have like a contrarian guest and their only worldview is to be contrarian in all aspects of their perspective, but it definitely helps. So again, I referenced this earlier in the session, but is it possible to combine 4A paths? Yes, absolutely. Some of the more common ones are going to be actionable and analytical. So again, when you think about, okay, if somebody does have a seven-step process that they've developed, well, how do they know that that was the right seven-step process? And oftentimes they know that because they've got data that proves that this way is more effective, more efficient, provides better outcomes than the other way, right? So that's why you see actionable and analytical oftentimes paired up together. Aspirational and anthropological, same thing. I remember there was a version of this wherein uh, what were some of the changes or what was some of the reasons why immigration began in full force a decade or 15 years ago, and it was oftentimes coupled with an individual story as to why they were leaving their home country, and then that was tied back to what was happening in their home country, right? So it was a personal story combined with a larger why, and I think the one that I'm thinking about in particular was Venezuelan immigrants and what was happening in Venezuela and why people were leaving, and then it was kind of compartmentalized within an individual's story as to why she was fleeing her home country. And then, of course, you're going to have aspirational and actionable. So this is going to be bigger in what I would call like the self-help kind of podcast world. If you think about like all the biohackers and Brian Johnson's, if anyone's familiar with him, Wim Hof, who's got his breathing method, that sort of thing. Aspirational is, hey, I want to be a more complete or a better version of myself, but I don't know how to do that. Well, if I do this Wim Hof seven-step breathing method, it's going to start my day with greater clarity and I'm going to be able to attack my day, right? So again, that's why we see that combination of aspirational and actionable. But again, we'll give you a couple of different examples here too. So this is going to be an example of an actual kind of chart that I put together, and this is from the guest side. So if you remember back to like the whole reason why we're here, step one is identifying what our guest's angle is going to be, and this is exactly that. This is takes it a little step further, but what we can see here is we looked at an existing episode. We analyzed the lens for both the podcast as well as the episode. We looked at the equivalent, and then we also looked at the needs, and we left a section for comments here, right? So they'd identified that this podcast was going to be a good fit. It's called the D2C podcast. And in doing this, I wanted to identify was there an existing episode? So why most YouTube ads fail and how to make yours work. Now they're approaching this through the lens of both anthropological and actionable. So why most YouTube ads fail? That's a why question. As we know, why questions are typically going to be anthropological, right? But it also includes and how to make yours work. Okay, that's going to be actionable. It might actually be analytical too. We don't know. If we were to go a little bit further, we could probably do that through the transcript analysis. But what was going to be the equivalent? So why most podcast ads fail and how to make yours work. Um, and I referenced this equivalent box here because sometimes, and if you attended the session that we had with Lauren Pissell, one of Lauren Pissell's really strong pieces of advice is do the producers work for them? the podcast producers work for them. And one of the means by which she exemplified that was actually through like create the title for the podcast for the producer and use that as your email subject line when you pitch, or pitch that idea, the episode title, as an idea within the podcast guest pitch itself. So again, if we know that they're creating episode titles like this, what would be the equivalent? Well, why most podcast ads fail and how to make yours work. And then in this column, the needs column, this is things that I need from the client in order to make good on the pitch and prepare the guest for the interview. So in order to get this kind of all summed up, I needed a step-by-step process, common mistakes and solutions, and then I also needed evidentiary data in order to, again, get the host's attention, craft the pitch, and ultimately get the guest set up for success for the interview itself. Same thing here. So in the existing episode of this podcast, how D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin, a guide to mobile ad success. Again, analytical. So how D2C brands are scaling. And then on the actionable side, a guide to mobile ad success. So what was the equivalent for my client? How D2C brands are scaling with podcast ads, a guide to audio success. This might seem lazy at first, and it kind of is because we're just swapping out our clients' bona fides with the existing podcast episode titles. But I think one thing that I think is really important about this, it almost provides a little bit of copy work. And I don't know if anybody's done copy work previously, but it's the simple act of taking like classic or world-renowned advertising copy and literally writing it out by hand. So some of the classic examples are like taking a David Ogilvy written ad and literally writing it out by hand. It gets your brain working in a way to it kind of primes your thought process and gets you closer to like what the end goal is going to be. So I like to actually write these out. I type them out. I don't handwrite them because it's going to spur some ideas for me as I begin to write my guest pitch itself. So instead of it saying just saying how to D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin and a guide to mobile success, I would not write that part out. I would write out how D2C brands are scaling with podcast ads, a guide to audio success. I would actually write that out. Because as I'm writing it out, I'm starting to think, ooh, what are some of the angles that I would need to include? What are some of the data I want to include in the pitch itself? And that's how I get to that needs column. So I need a step-by-step process. I need case studies and I need data and reports, right? So again, these are going to be exercises that your client's never going to see these things typically. It's going to take some time for you to do. But again, we know guest pitching has gotten a lot harder, especially over the last 6 months, 12 months. If you do these types of kind of foundational exercises, if you will, or do this level of intentional research, it's almost impossible to not stand out in an inbox as with a pitch because it's going to show the podcast host that you know them, they're the producer that you know them, and you've done your due diligence and done your due diligence and done your homework. Now, doesn't mean you're going to be able to scale. You can't scale outreach when you're doing it in this style. But ultimately, like, is that the goal? Like, our client wants to appear on X, Y, and Z podcast typically, and we want to chase impact as opposed to volume, in my opinion. So, again, this is going to be another exercise that you can use to kind of bridge that gap between our guest that we're representing and the podcast that's going to be a good fit. So now we're going to take it into what an actual pitch is going to look like. So you can see here, hey, Lori, I love when you said there's no linear path to love. I think people get so caught up in the idea of what should be that they miss out on a lot of great opportunities. If your audience is interested in more conversations around dating, I work with X, Y, and Z who tracks data within the app and some incredible insights into dating trends. Now, the podcast that this was pitched to, was one of those podcasts that had multiple A's in the 4A's framework, right? So one was the aspirational, sorry, I think it was aspirational as well as analytical. So they had married those two concepts together. So in this pitch that we constructed, the aspirational. I love when you said there's no linear path to love. That's going to be useful to identify that, yes, we're touching on that aspirational angle, but it's also going to show the podcaster that we know them because we actually listened to the episode. We looked at the transcript. We had a way to tie that into our guests' credentials, etc. And that's where we substantiate the pitch with, does it matter who makes the first move? How will plant-based diet impact likelihood of finding a match, et cetera. And that all goes back to the data, right? So the aspirational is going to be there's no path to linear love. Okay, no linear path to love. Yes, I resonate with that. I can see that. I'm okay. So I'm going to touch on the aspirational, but I also want to marry it to the data side. I want to marry the data storytelling, the analytical side to that. And that's where we see both of those kind of divergent paths meet here in the pitch itself. So again, I highly recommend doing this a few times. I'm happy to open up time in my calendar if you want to go through some of these exercises together because I know it's a little bit daunting and it's a kind of a heady subject, but this is what like an example of a useful 4A's is going to look like. Real quick to talk about formatting. A number of studies have been conducted over the last decade or so as everything has moved to digital, and it makes it a lot easier now that we can study these types of things. But one thing is you can notice here, this pitch itself is almost in the shape of an F. So if you look, starting on the far right side here and moving over, that's going to be like the top of our F, and then down is going to be like the side of the F, and then we've got, this kind of chunk here. A lot of research has shown us that most digital reading happens in an F-shaped pattern, which is why you see this podcast guest pitch shaped in an F-shaped manner, right? Kind of the bulk of the idea is going to be here, and then with that additional kind of validation, the bullet points kind of call out from the formatting perspective that these are some of the questions that are going to be asked, and that's going to hopefully show a little bit more resonance because as we scan through this, we want to see in a quick way as people are reading on their mobile devices, is there in between soccer practice drop off, whatever the case might be, like how do we maximize the skimmability of our guest pitches? And again, the formatting is going to be an easy way to do that. I also recommend typically bolding the client name. I recommend, sometimes highlighting important things, especially if something's under embargo, like highlight that and bold that. I know that's been a question we've received before. And then on the topic of links, right? Like, should I be including links? Should I be including attachments? That sort of thing. Um, Oftentimes, in this example here, the media kit was included as a link within this. Sometimes what I recommend actually is saving the media kit or links for a follow-up email. So like how do we bring the most relevance and kind of punch, if you will, into that initial pitch. And then on the follow-up, if we need to do some more substantiation, that's kind of a good soft landing spot for it there too. And then here's just gonna be another example. Hey Doug, great episode with Kendall on content creation. It seems like podcasts finally gone mainstream, etc. So as recognized, it's a little bit more spaced out, but this is also like an F-shaped email. So tie-in is going to be something immediate from the top. And in terms of the podcast that we were pitching with this, they were looking at um, actionable lens as well as analytical. So, as you can see within this pitch itself, how much podcasting has grown in the last 12 months. That's going to be data oriented. How PR agencies and in-house teams are using media monitoring to shape narratives. Again, that's going to be more of an actionable thing as well. So we knew that was the alignment from the actionable and the analytical on the podcast side. And then we also knew that from Bradley, who is our CEO, who's able to touch on that from the pitch perspective. And we blended those two things together, which is why you see this here. Now, both of these examples that I've just shown resulted in earned guest appearances for people we were working with. So again, this is going to be something that we want to practice. I don't expect anybody to get the 4A's framework immediately right off the bat. I personally didn't, and I find myself going back to these slides often, or going back to Dickie Bush's original ideas about 4A's as a result. So that is going to be it in a nutshell. Identify our clients' angles from the 4A's sides, content, or excuse me, actionable, analytical, anthropological, and aspirational. That's step one. Step two is identify the podcasts that fit those lenses. And then step three is going to be marrying the guests with the podcast content in the guest pitch itself, which again, we want to be F-shaped format, easily skimmable, easily scannable, leverage our follow-up emails tactfully. That's often a great place to dump our links, our media kits, and that sort of thing as well. So that is going to conclude our session here today. If anybody has any questions or wants to go deeper in any of these things, again, reach out to me, Trent at podchaser.com. Reach out to your client success manager, John, Jules, or Sydney, and they'll take care of you from there too. And again, this video, as well as the slides, will be available early next week on our YouTube channel and via email, respectively. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate you, and have an awesome weekend.